Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is up, you guys? Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I am recording this intro after dark in Costa Rica, which is why if you are watching on YouTube, you can tell that this is candlelight right now and red lights, because I don't like a lot of blue light. I'm enjoying having the circadian rhythms be a little bit better and trained while I'm in Costa Rica. A huge part of the reason that I'm here is this is sort of my version of, quote, the remembering, trying to live in the most evolutionarily, ancestrally consistent way possible. And as you guys all know, a huge part of that for me is getting organs in my diet and helping you guys get organs in your diet. I've been working with George St. Pierre this month as he's doing an animal-based diet. You can follow him at George St. Pierre. If you don't know him, he's a very well-known, prolific, considered by many to be the greatest MMA fighter of all time. And he's been loving an animal-based diet. And there was a comment on his Instagram today, which was, how are you getting all the vegetables? How are you getting all the nutrients that are found in vegetables if you're not eating vegetables? And the answer is clear, that it's by eating organs. And with organs, you're getting a ton of nutrients that are even not found in vegetables. And I've talked about this many times. So this is one of the reasons that I love organs in my diet. I eat them every day. I take our supplements every day from Heart and Soil. We do grass-fed, grass-finished, regeneratively raised supplements from New Zealand. We're developing a US-based supply chain. And simply put, I think that getting more organs in your life will enhance your overall health, no matter who you are. This is an ancestrally, evolutionarily consistent thing that our ancestors have always done. And it's a huge part of human health to get these nutrients. Every week I've been reading a review because I think that these reviews are super striking. This one is for our beef organs product from Ted. He said these capsules are very easy to swallow. I take 3 in the morning and 3 at night. Over the last couple of months while I've been taking them, I've noticed a marked improvement with joint and musculoskeletal pain, mental health, clarity, functional strength, cravings, energy, and stamina throughout the day, and sleep quantity and quality. I'm not really a fan of eating organs, so these supplements work great for me. Thank you, Dr. Paul, for all you do to improve the health and our health and wellness. This is exactly why I do what I do, guys. Hopefully you heard my controversial thoughts last week about why I do what I do, but people like Ted are so important. This means the world to me that putting desiccated organs into capsules that are easy to swallow allows more people to benefit. And that is why we do what we do at Heart and Soil. You can find us at heartandsoil.co. If you need more desiccated organs, if you need organs, this nose-to-tail nutrition in your life, check it out. This will benefit you, I promise you. This week's podcast is with my friend, Robert English. This man is a savant when it comes to hair loss. And a lot of you guys, both men and women, have asked about hair loss. We released a product at Heart and Soil, Skin, Hair, and Nails, a few months ago, and I got tons of questions. Will this product help with hair loss? And as you'll hear in this podcast, I absolutely think it will. This product contains liver, special types of collagen from trachea and scapula, and other animal-based nutrients are in there, which are really going to be helpful for the regeneration of skin and support of all the bones and joints. But as you'll hear in this podcast with Robert English, hair loss is also about nutrients, which can promote proper regeneration of hair when hair is naturally shed. So anyway, that has to do with skin, hair, and nails. This podcast is about hair loss for men and women. Specifically, we're talking about men, but it's applicable to women too. And some of the resources that Robert talks about in this podcast are amazing. He's really reversed his male pattern balding and hair loss significantly with the methods he describes in here. We talk about drugs, whether they're useful or not. We talk about massage for the scalp. We talk about microneedling. We do talk about nutrients and the importance of getting the nutrients to improve hair regeneration. Anecdotally, I've heard about improvements in hair loss with carnivore diets, with nose-to-tail carnivore diets, with animal-based diets, etc. So I think you're really going to like this podcast with Robert on male hair loss, and I hope this is a huge benefit to you guys. I hope it's a great resource for you. Also want to say thank you to my sponsors, White Oak Pastures. WhiteOakPastures.com is the 6th generation regenerative farm in Bluffton, Georgia, really leading the way in terms of regenerative agriculture. they are the champions of this and should be congratulated and supported for the work they're doing. They have grass-fed, grass-finished beef. They have goats. They have turkeys and chickens, and they have sheep, lamb, and the chickens, many of them are raised corn and soy free. So if you're interested in that, look for that on the website as well. They also do organ meats. I love the people at White Oak Pastures. We should be voting with our dollars. I talked about this in a recent post in my podcast with Robbie Sansom. Vote with your dollars. You cannot abstain from voting with your dollars. You are either voting for Monsanto and Unilever and Nestle and Cargill, or you are voting for small, moderate-sized regenerative farms like White Oak and Belcampo, which are hugely important for the creation of ecosystems and the health of our planet. So these farms are carbon negative. I'll also give a shout out to Belcampo, but I'll tell you that at White Oak Pastures and at Belcampo, you can get discounts on your first order using the code CarnivoreMD. So Belcampo is the farm in Northern California. We just did a sweepstakes with them. Happy to announce, we announced the winner on social media, and they was for a year supply of Belcampo meat and a year supply of hard and soil supplements. We'll do another one with them soon. Hopefully we'll do a sweepstakes with White Oak Pastures as well. But Belcampo is an amazing farm in Northern California that's also been certified as a greenhouse gas negative farm, meaning they are sequestering more carbon into the soil than they are producing. This is what we should be voting for with our dollars, guys. So please support White Oak Pastures. Please support Belcampo. And in the process, you will get amazingly good quality and amazingly good tasting meat and organs, etc. Belcampo is in Northern California. Bluffton, Georgia is in obviously Southern Georgia. So if you're on the East Coast, check out White Oak. If you're on the West Coast or the center of the country, check out Belcampo, or wherever you are, check out both of the farms. They're both delicious and amazing producers and supporters of regenerative agriculture. I am proud to support them in this podcast and will continue to do so as long as we can. Also want to give a shout out to my buddy Monsel, whose company Sacred Hunting is really a pretty unique way to have your first hunting experience. You can go to sacredhunting.com/Paul to get a $250 discount. I went hunting with Monsel in January of 2020 and was able to shoot a deer with a bow. But the cool thing about what Monsel does with these Sacred Hunting sort of trips is that they become rites of passage for men. You learn the basics of how to track, stalk, kill, and field dress wild game animals, but Monsel adds ritual and Native American components that make it a much deeper experience. There's gratitude practices. We met every morning and night to talk about our experiences being in nature. We shared meat with our friends on this hunt. They're really, really great experience. I think if you want to get into hunting, you can be a beginner or you can be experienced. It's amazing to go hunting with Monsel and to share the bounty of that with the people that you care about who will hopefully come on the trip with you. So you can save $250 by mentioning my name. There's 5 spots on each hunt. So visit sacredhunting.com/Paul, fill out the 2-minute application, set up an exploratory call with Monsel. I really think that you will benefit from this. Another thing that I think you will benefit from is red light therapy. So you guys know that I'm a fan of what Joovv does. If you're looking for a new Joovv, that's Joovv. It's a super exciting time. You can go to joovv.com/Paul, use the code Paul, Paul, to get a discount on Joovv's Generation 3.0 devices. I love getting red light in my day, whether it's from the sun, the sunset, the sunrise, or red light devices when I can't get enough of that. I like to use the Joovv products. That's Joovv. I've seen benefits firsthand in terms of sleep, recovery, skin health, all kinds of things like that. If you're familiar with red light therapy, you know that Joovv is far and away the leading brand. They pioneered the technology, being the first to isolate red and near infrared wavelengths, make it accessible and affordable for in-home use. They've got a new line of devices coming, which are going to level this up in a big way. They're sleeker and lighter, but the same power you've come to expect with their devices. They have some pretty cool new features like Recovery Plus mode, which uses pulse near infrared light technology to give your cells extra healing boost, optimizing the recovery process. And they also have ambient mode, uses a lower intensity light to support sleep and circadian rhythms and counteract artificial blue light, junk blue light, processed light that kind of messes you up. They've got new setup with easy mounting options, so you can put them anywhere in your home. So if you're looking for a new Joovv, you need more red light in your life, go to joovv.com/Paul, use the code Paul. You'll get an exclusive discount on their new Generation 3 devices. Exclusions apply, limited time only. And last but not least, in fact, last but perhaps most importantly, if you like this podcast, please leave me a review wherever you listen to this podcast, because it helps us spread the message. Listen to the controversial thoughts last week about why I do what I do, and you will understand that this is my purpose, my passion, and helping really 100 million, a billion people experience the benefits of an animal-based diet is what I am all about and super passionate about. So leaving a review really helps with that. On to the podcast. Love you all. Stay radical. Rob, thanks for coming on the podcast, man. It is amazing to have you here. At Heart and Soil, we recently released a new supplement that I'm super excited about, in hair and nails. And because it had hair in the title of this collagen, liver, and bone marrow supplement, I got a lot of questions about, can you regrow hair? These men asking, can I regrow male pattern baldness? Can I regrow hair? And so I think people are really going to get a lot of value out of this conversation talking about hair loss, which is something that affects both men and women. And I just, from the outset, want to mention that you have an amazing head of hair. And in honor of this conversation, I've grown a lot of. So between the two of us, we are crushing the hair game, my man.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm excited, and we've got a lot to talk about.
Yeah, so did you ever, you're probably too young for this, but when I was growing up, there were these Hair Club for Men commercials. Are you familiar with these? And at the end of the Hair Club for Men, he goes, I'm not only an advocate for the Hair Club for Men, I'm also a customer. And I think that you have a story. I mean, maybe we can just start with your Hair Club for Men story. And, you know, I think you have a story of your own hair regrowth, and it's just, I just love, that's just such a meme of a commercial. But tell us the story of your hair journey and how you got to have this amazing head of hair. Before the podcast, our listeners are not privy to the fact that I tried to convince you to grow a beard, and I hope that you will, but I'm convinced that you could grow a good beard too.
Well, thank you. Yeah, today I am a medical editor. I'm a peer-reviewed hair loss researcher. I'm on the editorial board of a dermatology journal called Dermatology and Therapy, and my life revolves around hair loss research, and that includes hair loss disorder research ranging from alopecia areata to telogen effluvium to androgenic alopecia to scarring disorders. But if you rewound 15 years ago and asked me, oh, what are you going to do with your life? I would have never told you that I was going to be involved in hair loss research at all. In fact, I only became interested in hair loss research out of self-interest because when I was 15 years old, still in high school, this girl poked the back of my head and notified me that I had a bald spot. And I kind of laughed it off because it's high school and you have to act tough and, you know, things can't bother you. But it really psychologically affected me, and I thought to myself, well, you know, pattern baldness has a strong predisposition in my family. Has this already started for me, and yet I haven't noticed? So when I was 17, I went to a dermatologist in New England, and he quickly diagnosed me with male pattern hair loss, which is this chronic, progressive hair loss disorder that presents as temple thinning and then crown thinning. And it progresses to a slick, bald scalp, and it is impossible to walk down a city block without noticing somebody with this condition. It is so ubiquitous in the westernized population if you live long enough. And needless to say, I was kind of devastated because I was the only person that I knew who was facing this condition at this age, so it felt really isolating from a psychological standpoint. But then also I was a little bit dismayed at my treatment options. And so when I had this appointment, the dermatologist basically specified that I can start to use a topical application called minoxidil, which basically improves vasodilation. It has some prostaglandin modulating activity, but there's still a lot of uncertainty to exactly how that works. And that the outcomes for that would be that I might be able to slow this process down, maybe temporarily see a little bit of hair regrowth. And then the other options were more pharmaceutical in nature in terms of reducing a typical hormone that is associated with the progression of male pattern hair loss. And that's the drug finasteride, which is a DHT reducer. So testosterone has this metabolite called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. And DHT has a very strong relationship with male pattern hair loss. In fact, when you rewind to research from the 1940s, Hamilton, this doctor, observed in male castrates that men who were castrated before puberty, whereby they'd see a 95% reduction in testosterone and presumably DHT levels as a consequence, since DHT is a metabolite of testosterone, those men were protected from developing male pattern hair loss later on in life. And later on, there were anecdotal pieces of evidence from this island in Papua New Guinea where these men overexpressed with this genetic mutation called a type 2,5 alpha reductase deficiency. And what it showed us is that it's not testosterone overall that's causing hair loss, but rather these men with this very specific type 2,5 alpha reductase deficiency also never lost their hair to male pattern hair loss and yet had normal testosterone levels. So the research moved from testosterone as a whole more so specific to one type of testosterone metabolite, the type that converts from type 2,5 alpha reductase into DHT. And so this is the basis by which a drug like finasteride, a type 2,5 alpha reductase inhibitor, or a DHT reducer was developed. And for men, it's this really powerful drug for pattern hair loss. And so my doctor gave me the spiel about the side effect risks of reducing this hormone and then the expected outcomes. And again, it was basically you can stop pattern hair loss. The evidence suggests in 80 to 90% of the men taking this drug over a 2-year period, you're going to see a 10% increase in hair count. But I had lost a lot more than 10% of my hair at that point, and that didn't really sound like a fair trade-off to be taking a drug that I'm relegated for the rest of my life for a cessation of this condition that I totally wanted to avoid and reverse at a much higher degree. On top of that, I was going to college to be a Division I athlete. And so I had no idea what the impacts of reducing a specific hormone, especially at 17 years old, would have on the rest of my development and my athletic performance. Now, if I knew then what I knew today, I probably would have just started taking finasteride, experienced 0 changes to athletic performance, no side effects, seen pretty solid hair regrowth, and I probably have a different career right now. But because I was worried about these things, and because when I went online, I bumped into all of this information about these scary anecdotes of post-finasteride syndrome, people having prolonged side effects, I really worried about the possibility of using this drug. And after basically taking it for 2 days, I panicked and threw the bottle out the next day. And so this kind of left me with a very limited, narrow range of treatment choices. I was using minoxidil twice daily. And that kind of gave me some solace in the sense that, well, okay, maybe I'm doing something. And so I can relax in the sense that I know that I'm trying to fix this problem. And that kind of took the mental edge of losing my hair off. But it still continued to progress. I mean, I have these photos on my site that show what the crown of my head looked like in 2007, what the crown of my head looked like in 2003 before I ever noticed I was losing hair, and then what it looks like in 2011, 4 years after minoxidil use. And it's very clear that things are just getting worse despite me investing hundreds and hundreds of dollars into this treatment. And so at this stage, I was also in college. I had access to a ton of different medical journals and scholarly journals. And I became kind of like this closet nerd for pattern hair loss. And it just became this obsession because I had access to the full texts of all these things. And learning more about this condition and trying to solve it outside of that initial drug model basically became this hobby that acted as this gateway into my fascination with hair loss research overall. And that just continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. And eventually, when I did see success outside of the drug model, I developed such a wealth of knowledge that I started a website that demonstrated the techniques that I used, how other people could use them, and in addition to that, the evidence supporting them. And in doing so, everything was kind of donation-based. That's perfecthairhealth.com. That's my website right now. And it grew over the years as more anecdotes emerged that these techniques worked for people and that there were some solutions outside of the drug model if people didn't have that desire to take these drugs. So that was my foray into the research side of things. And then that continued to progress. And so at some point in this entire journey, somebody was discussing my website on Reddit and had mentioned that if any of these ideas held merit, they should be published in a peer-reviewed journal. And it was meant as this criticism, but I thought to myself, you know what, that is absolutely correct. There's nothing that precludes me from publishing this type of content in a medical journal, submitting it to peer review, and I should do that in honor of what I believe to be true about this condition. And in addition to that, I should do that to prove to myself that a lot of these things that we discuss on our website probably have some scientific merit. So that was my foray into writing medical papers, and I published my first peer-reviewed paper about hair loss in 2017. We published our second one in 2018. We now have a small research team that works on pumping out manuscripts regarding different pathophysiologies of hair loss, gaps in the research for what we do and don't know, hypotheses related to why there's conflicting results in the histological features of some investigations into balding scalps and non-balding scalps, and everything in between. And it's become this really incredible project that's now run through this membership website where we dedicate ourselves to helping people find a path toward hair regrowth with the drug model, without the drug model. It doesn't really matter to me. What matters is that people are going to see success on their own terms, and there's a pathway to do that.
That's awesome. It's so interesting. And we'll get into your story and all these techniques and what you've learned and some of these different types of hair loss and how we can go about sort of combating them. But let's just start with finasteride. And maybe people will be aware of this, but as you suggested, there is this conversion between testosterone and dihydrotestosterone mediated by this enzyme 5-alpha reductase. And this is also a series of hormones that are important for prostatic hypertrophy. And these drugs, finasteride and dutasteride or dutasteride, whatever you want to pronounce it, are used for benign prostatic hypertrophy, which is enlargement of the prostate that happens in many men as they age. Now, it sounded to me like you don't think that taking finasteride would have had any negative effects on your performance. That's interesting to me. I've never had male pattern hair loss to a significant degree, so I can't speak from this, and I haven't delved into the literature deeply, but just intuitively, and perhaps I'm wrong about this, and you can correct me if I am, I worry about abrogating or abolishing a hormone like dihydrotestosterone in men that is probably is there for some purpose, right? Like, I would be worried about abolishing an androgen like DHT. Anecdotally, I've heard Joe Rogan talk about this on his podcast. I think he was taking finasteride, I believe, and again, it's just anecdote of one, but it's a Rogan anecdote, so I have to mention it. And he felt like his erections actually got better after he stopped finasteride. But what is your sense of that? Do you think DHT is really just like a redundant hormone? Is there really not any evidence that taking finasteride could have negative effects on performance for males especially?
It's a really good question, and it's an answer that's going to require a lot of context, nuance, and will probably be a little bit polarizing for whoever decides to listen to this. There are a ton of examples whereby researchers considered vestiges of the past, like our wisdom teeth or like our appendix, as things that we don't need. And you can take these things out without any ramifications. But the reality is that our wisdom teeth don't grow in correctly and have to be removed because our faces don't develop correctly because our nutrition is all messed up during development. In addition to that, the mechanical stress required to chew the jaw to get it wide enough to support the tongue pressing against the top of the roof is part of the reason why our faces grow longer than they should, and it's why our wisdom teeth don't grow in. So the research there is also polarizing, and there's a debate over how inessential our wisdom teeth actually are. In my opinion, they're very important, and we're not doing enough to keep them around. Likewise, I had my appendix removed in 2005, 2006. And at the time, it's this emergency situation. The surgeon who's operating on me tells me right before we go in, don't worry, we do this all the time. The appendix is completely useless. Well, lo and behold, several years down the road, it turns out that the appendix is this place where commensal microflora from the microbiome harbor during periods of illness so that our small and large intestine can clear out the pathogens. And then when this illness is over, those bacteria remigrate and repopulate the small and large intestine in a commensal fashion. So that's two examples right there of researchers just totally getting it wrong in terms of what is and isn't essential for the body. So that brings us to this topic of DHT. Well, DHT is this hormone that is absolutely critical for neonatal development, early childhood development, and then pubertal development. And the reason we know this is because you know those men from Papua New Guinea that we mentioned earlier who lack that type 2 5-alpha reductase enzyme, so they have that genetic deficiency where they don't produce that type of DHT in development, they actually develop as pseudo-hermaphrodites. So what that means is that they have ambiguous genitalia until hitting puberty, and then they develop genitalia, but they're much smaller than normal. And so DHT is a pretty important hormone. It has neurosteroid properties. It has developmental properties. But in adulthood, it seems like that hormone, at least with the evidence so far, is less necessary. Now, you mentioned earlier this topic of physical performance and muscular development. This has actually been studied in men and training athletes taking finasteride and dutasteride. So they've had two different groups of people who have taken finasteride and dutasteride and done muscle training exercises for a period of a year, and then another group in the controls who aren't taking the drug. And there seems to be no change in relative subcutaneous fat density or muscle tissue density, suggesting that dihydrotestosterone can be replaced by testosterone when you begin to reduce that hormone in the body. So there's almost like a fallback mechanism. Now, what's interesting about that is that we actually see dihydrotestosterone increase uniquely in two different scenarios in the body. We see it in cases of low testosterone men. So DHT has a 4 to 5x affinity for the androgen receptor relative to testosterone. So people consider it a much more potent male hormone. And what that means is that DHT, when testosterone lowers, more of it is going to convert into DHT so that people can be protected and have the same metabolic function and anabolic function as if you had normal testosterone levels and then your DHT needed to reduce. Likewise, we also see it in steroid users because their testosterone increases, and then free testosterone begins to convert at a higher rate to DHT. But that's from a different set of circumstances. And so it seems as though testosterone and DHT have this interplay where for most people, you're in a position to really benefit from preventing the progression of pattern hair loss while taking this drug and not sacrificing muscle gains. Now, it's worth mentioning that these studies that I'm talking about, they're relatively small sample sizes compared to the big studies on men that got finasteride into FDA approval. We have 1,000 people in the treatment group. We have 1,000 people in the placebo group. And over a 2 to 5 year period, the risk of side effects for finasteride in the treatment group, 1.8% reported for men ages 18 to 41, so people who should be pretty active, pretty virile. No mentions at all of changes to musculature. But then in the control group, you see an incidence of 1.3% for sexual side effects. So you get this 0.5 percentage point difference amongst these really well-controlled, double-blinded, placebo-controlled studies demonstrating that this drug, it probably isn't as dangerous or as bad as most people cite. Having said that, it's complicated. And what makes this even more complicated is that there are absolutely manifestations where finasteride can increase your risk of side effects or decrease your risk of side effects depending on other attributes of the body. For example, there was a study that showed that men who were left-handed actually saw an increased rate of sexual functionality from taking finasteride. But men who were right-handed were way more likely to report sexual side effects. here's the other thing that gets really confusing. There's a psychosomatic element behind taking this drug. There was one study that demonstrated that men who were just simply told that the drug might cause side effects were 500% more likely to report sexual side effects than the group who was just prescribed the drug without any knowledge of that whatsoever. Now, the other thing is that saw palmetto is kind of considered this natural finasteride. So it's this type of extract that's derived from the Serenoa repens plant that grows like weeds down in Florida, and it has type 2 5-alpha reductase inhibiting activity. However, it is way less effective than finasteride in terms of reducing DHT. And on top of that, the type of fatty acids responsible for that DHT reduction, the polyphenols, the phytosterols, those have a very, very short half-life. And so if it does reduce any DHT at all, it does not do it for a very long time. Now, the reason that I mention this is because in European and Caucasian populations, you'll still find a ton of anecdotes online of saw palmetto causing finasteride-like side effects. Sexual dysfunction, brain fog, cognitive dysfunction. But then in Native American populations, you just switch your culture that you're studying, they use saw palmetto as an aphrodisiac. That's been studied for hundreds of years. So in one culture, a type 2 5-alpha reductase inhibitor increases libido. In another, it inhibits. And then there's all this psychosomatic evidence, and then there's these big question marks as to the long-term side effects of finasteride and the usage of DHT and its necessity in adulthood. And this is just a long-winded way of me saying, I have no idea. I have no idea if DHT is incredibly important in adulthood, and we just haven't made that discovery yet. I'm absolutely open to that possibility, but at least so far from these 10-year-long studies on finasteride, it seems like the side effect profiles for things like prostate cancer or neurocognitive decline, it's not as bad as the anecdotes online in these echo chambers on anonymous hair loss forums seem to suggest. And that's by no means an endorsement of this drug. It's just information.
And that's super valuable because I've always wondered about that. There are other natural compounds that inhibit 5-alpha reductase like astaxanthin. So I'll screen share this this paper. So preliminary investigation of the enzymatic inhibition of 5-alpha reduction and growth of prostatic carcinoma cell line, LNC, or LNCap-FGC by natural astaxanthin and saw palmetto lipid extract in vitro. So there was a time in the past when I first started with the carnivore diet, I was very interested in fish eggs, in salmon roe. And then one of my friends said, hey, you know, those have astaxanthin and that inhibits DHT, or at least the formation of DHT. And I thought, oh man, maybe this is something I need to look into. So I've always kind of puzzled that in the back of my head. But astaxanthin occurs in natural foods. It occurs in shrimp and some seafood, and occurs in salmon roe. And I've always wondered, like, should we be inhibiting 5-alpha reductase with this? I imagine in food it's a lower concentration, it's temporary, it's transient as opposed to chronic. Maybe kids shouldn't, kids in development, maybe they shouldn't have a lot of salmon roe. It's just interesting to think about this kind of crossover, and I wonder about the unique role of DHT in the human body. When I learned that, I kind of cut back on my intake of salmon roe, and now am sort of the opinion that most of us can get plenty of omega-3s just from grass-fed animal fat like suet or tallow, and I don't think we have to over-consume omega-3s. But I'm always of the opinion that an ancestral food like fish eggs is something we would have always eaten when we had access to it, even if that was rare. So it's a curious question. Thanks for sharing your perspective on that. So yeah, go ahead.
And it's always dose dependent and context specific as well. So salmon roe might have type 2 5-alpha reductase inhibiting properties in the context of certain diets that constitute certain gut microflora. And in cell studies or in mouse models, you might see these reductions depending on massive dosages of an extract from salmon roe. Astaxanthin at the milligram dosage that most people can buy in supplemental form, it can reduce 5-alpha reductase inhibiting properties. And this almost feeds back into the psychosomatic effects of whether or not finasteride does have that same risk of side effects as perceived online, because a lot of people who are taking these supplements, they have no idea that they're also reducing that enzymatic activity to lower DHT, and yet they're very fearful of trying finasteride because they don't want to reduce that enzymatic activity to lower DHT. So the translatability to human models is important. I think that astaxanthin is specifically interesting because it also has been shown in double-blinded placebo-controlled studies to improve skin quality and potentially collagen synthesis as well. But again, it is this thing that we don't really know a lot about it, and one single study isn't going to give us enough insights to make some sort of giant recommendation. I mean, even with the drug finasteride and dutasteride, which is an even more powerful type 1 and type 2 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, there have been thousands of studies on these things. We still don't have enough information to know what's really going on.
It's a conundrum. And I'm glad that we were able to discuss the mainstream therapy, but I think the majority of the focus of this podcast is going to be on other things that we can do and how we can think about male pattern hair loss, even without medications. And so I don't want anyone listening to this thinking that this is just about medications, though many men and women also perhaps are going to be faced with making a decision about these drugs. So that's a good baseline for that. Now, when people ask me about hair loss, I always have to kind of ask them a question in return, which is, are you sure this is androgenic alopecia? Is it alopecia areata? Is this telogen effluvium? There are numerous things that can cause hair loss. And why don't you walk us through quickly what the different types of hair loss are? Because it's important that people understand that all hair loss is not androgenic alopecia. And women can have hair loss. And on your website, there are multiple examples of women with thin things like this. And so, I'm actually hanging out in Costa Rica with a friend of mine, and he told me, I told him I was doing this podcast today, and he said, I hit my head really hard one time, and I lost hair in that spot. And then it grew back over the course of about a year. And I thought, okay, see, this is not androgenic. This is a totally different thing. So walk us through this a little bit. What are these different types of hair loss? How does hair grow? Talk to us about the follicle and give us a little bit of perspective on these different possibilities.
Sure. And I apologize for driving so much of the conversation toward finasteride. The irony is that I don't use finasteride, and I actually prefer an all-natural route of treatment for myself. So we've really focused too much on that specific conversation, and I'm happy to rein this back. And you're right, this is an absolute perfect entry point to talk about the broader discussions of hair loss, the different pathologies, the different types, and then what to do about them. So when you think about hair loss, if you wanted to really, really simplify this, you can kind of break hair loss into two distinct categories. The first bucket is pattern hair loss. That's male and female pattern hair loss, or androgenic alopecia, AGA. And this is more of a chronic and progressive type of hair loss disorder that's characterized histologically through what's known as hair follicle miniaturization. So the actual hair strands over time get thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner until they become so wispy and so short that you can't see them anymore. And at that point for men, your temporal recession has receded, the bald spot has grown, you've got the slick bald scalp. For women, it more so presents as diffuse thinning, so just general thinning throughout the top of the scalp. But this condition is, again, characterized through hair follicle miniaturization, and it's chronic, progressive, and it can affect both men and women. It's androgenic or hormone related, and there's a genetic predisposition behind it. So that's kind of the first bucket of hair loss disorders. The second bucket can be categorized really broadly as hair cycle disorders or hair shedding disorders. And this is going to include things like telogen effluvium, chronic telogen effluvium, but essentially with these types of hair loss disorders, there's some sort of acute stressor, whether that's psychological or physiological stress, a nutrient deficiency, hypothyroidism, hyperparathyroidism, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, gut dysbiosis, heavy metal toxicity, certain medication usages. And what these things end up doing is that they end up raising inflammation in the body and certain signaling proteins signal to exit the hair cycle faster at the top of the scalp as a consequence to that inflammation. And so you'll get too many hairs shedding out prematurely and then too few hairs growing back in. So there's this gap between where the hairs have shed out and then when the hairs are coming back in. Now, the big difference between pattern hair loss and hair shedding disorders is that hair shedding disorders are almost always temporary. So you identify that underlying cause, say it's a nutrient deficiency, you address it, you remove your stress. Within 3 to 8 months, a lot of research has demonstrated that the hair cycle normalizes, those hairs come back, and then within a year or two, it looks as though you've never lost any hair at all. The thing that confuses people online and at doctor's offices is that so many people that I communicate with will say, yeah, I got this job and I had a full head of hair and 3 years later I lost it all to stress. And they're presenting perfectly with male pattern hair loss. And that's only partially true because there's actually an intersection point where male pattern hair loss and telogen effluvium hair shedding disorders collide. And that's that the only way that pattern hair loss can progress is actually through hair shedding. And we know this because if you measure the hairs affected by pattern hair loss from the tip all the way down to the root, the diameter of the hair is exactly the same, which shows that that hair is growing and not miniaturizing as it's actively growing. Rather, what happens is that that hair sheds as a part of its natural hair cycle. The old hair follicle degenerates as a part of its natural hair cycle. And then a new hair follicle comes in to replace that hair follicle. Again, this is all part of the natural hair cycle. This happens all the time. Between 10 to 15% of our hairs shed on a regular basis and undergo this every single day. Now, the thing is that with pattern hair loss, the action of DHT attacks the base of that hair follicle, and most specifically, this cell cluster called the dermal papillae. And what that does is it induces a signaling protein called transforming growth factor beta 1, and that causes apoptosis or cell death in the dermal papillae. Well, interestingly enough, the dermal papillae cell cluster is like the powerhouse of the hair follicle. It determines the size that the hair follicle will grow. So with fewer cell counts, you form a smaller hair follicle, which then produces a thinner hair strand. And what this means is that hair follicle miniaturization is a single step process. It only occurs after you shed hair. So what this suggests is then, let's go back to that person who was really stressed out and lost all of their hair in a 3-year period because of this job that they took. Well, they said that it was because of stress. But from an evidence standpoint, stress only causes telogen effluvium. So what really happened is that this person had the predisposition for male pattern hair loss. They already had the ingredients and the androgens necessary to begin that process of hair follicle miniaturization. And stress led to excessive hair shedding, which then fed into the miniaturization process. It accelerated it. And why this is so interesting is because there is a ton of evidence coming out that in the westernized world, the incidence of pattern hair loss is increasing and its age of onset is accelerating. And you think about the types of stress that people are under on a regular basis, sleep quality, working hours, diet, the processed foods, the sugars, the nutrient deficiencies, the number of Americans that have a vitamin D deficiency that corresponds with telogen effluvium-based shedding. And then you look at how many people are balding today relative to 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The survey-based evidence out of China, which has been rapidly westernizing, is that in 2010, 2.9% of men aged 18 to 29 were facing pattern hair loss at a cosmetic level. Now, survey data suggests that 60% of China-based university students notice visible hair loss, a massive increase. And the explanation here is that there's crosstalk between these hair shedding disorders and then the rate that we miniaturize. And if you start to shed a lot and you're under chronic stress, you've got these nutrient deficiencies, you've got low-grade hypothyroidism, if you only try to target this male pattern hair loss equation by reducing DHT, you're selling yourself short of significant results, and you're probably not going to see success. And so looping this all the way back to the discussion with your friend who hit his head, saw that bald spot form, and then over a year had that grow back, that's actually more so related to like an injury-related telogen effluvium bout. We see this all the time with my dad used to wear high socks to work. And when he would take his socks off, you could see like a clear delineation of where there was hair, and then where he wore his socks, there would be no hair at all. So there's this thing called pressure alopecia, and that can also occur as a result of types of surgeries where the head isn't stabilized or is stabilized for too long without moving. And in addition to that, injury, where there's a lot of swelling to the tissue, which causes an increased hair cycle and shed. But it's not androgenic alopecia. It's not stress-related hair loss. It's a different type of cause. And if you don't make an effort to understand your individual causes of hair loss, you're not going to see the outcomes that you want. And so that's all very doom and gloom. There's a lot of hope here. You can treat these things if you decide to educate yourself, and there's a lot of options both naturally and conventionally. But those are the two big buckets of hair loss. The one that we didn't talk about are the autoimmune forms and the scarring forms of hair loss. And those more so relate to dysregulations to the immune function of the follicle themselves, the collapse of immune privilege so that the body begins to attack the hair follicles. And the strongest evidence that we have behind these things is that there's some sort of environmental factor triggering them, and it very closely corresponds to gut dysbiosis.
It's super fascinating, and this is such an important point that I want to just make it one more time so that everybody listening understands it. Because if I'm hearing you properly, there's a real interplay between telogen effluvium and male pattern hair loss, in that the cycling of the hair follicle, meaning that the loss of the hair and the regrowth of the follicle, if that is accelerated, then the actions of an androgenic alopecia and DHT, apoptosis, and the stem cells in the hair follicle could be accelerated. It seems very probable to me that in a lot of men today, their androgenic alopecia could be accelerated, and women. Their androgenic alopecia, or DHT, hormonal-related loss of hair, is almost certainly accelerated by stress, pervasive nutrient deficiencies, and these things that are causing increases in this corresponding telogen effluvium. Do I have all that proper in my, am I thinking about that correctly?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the problem right now that consumers face is that they don't get that education at an online level. They don't get that education at the doctor's office, because that doctor has 7 minutes with you and therefore can only look at your hair loss and say, it looks like pattern hair loss. Here's a prescription for finasteride. Start taking minoxidil. Consider a hair transplant. They have no time to actually dive into your health to explore what your diet is like, what your environment at home is like, what your working hours look like, how much activity you're getting on a regular basis, whether or not you expose yourself to sunlight, whether or not your cold hands, cold feet, and brain fog are symptomatic and worthy of a TSH test for hypothyroidism, whether or not there's calcium dysregulation in your blood panels, which might suggest hyperparathyroidism or some sort of benign tumor growing on one of the parathyroid glands. There's none of that. And so consumers just go to the office, they get a prescription for finasteride, maybe they see success, but a growing number of people are non-responders to this drug, at least anecdotally, and from my experience tracking people over a number of years. And it's because nobody takes the time to address that other side of the equation. And it's very likely that this is the reason why pattern hair loss, in my opinion, is accelerating in the developed world.
Now, interestingly, this same friend who hit his head and had trauma-related apparent telogen effluvium also tried a vegan diet. And the reason that he stopped doing a vegan diet was twofold. The first was that he noticed that his hair was coming out in clumps in the shower, that he was actually shedding hair in the shower, which was probably some combination. Again, this is an anecdote, this is an N of one, but anyone that's listened to this podcast for any amount of time will know that I have major concerns about plant-based diets long-term and nutrient deficiencies. But this could have been evolving hypothyroidism in him due to too many isothiocyanates or inadequate iodine absorption in conjunction with excess vegetables. Could have been overall nutrient deficiencies. We're going to talk about biotin, though there's some nuance there as well, as you'll tell us about. but inadequate collagen, inadequate creatine, and inadequate all these other animal-based nutrients. And that was one of the reasons that he stopped doing this vegan diet. Now he eats an animal-based diet, which is amazing. And incidentally, the second reason was that his wife told him that he was getting too emotional and he was eating too many soybeans and too many estrogens, and she wanted him to stop eating a vegan diet so he would be more emotionally stable. Again, just a comical anecdote. Who knows if that's actually what was going on? But let's just state that in the popular space, there are some who are eating plant-based diets who do appear to be less emotionally jubilant, less emotionally stable, and perhaps a little more angry. But I'm just saying, like, who knows?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's certain advantages and disadvantages of basically any diet that you want to try. For me personally, I've tried all of them because when I was in that period where I was looking for a solution outside of the drug model, I tried vegetarianism, veganism, paleo, low-carb paleo, ketogenic dieting. I tried the Gerson therapy juicing cleanse. I tried fasting. And I never really saw any of these diets move the needle for me in terms of hair loss. And in fact, what ends up happening is that a lot of people who experiment with these diets actually position themselves not to regrow hair, but to develop a diet-specific nutrient deficiency or caloric deficiency that accelerates or exacerbates bouts of telogen effluvium, and then it just feeds right back into the process of pattern hair loss. Now, the other thing worth mentioning is that we just published a new paper, and in that paper, part of the paper interviewed a variety of dermatologists and asked them what I consider to be a really important question, which is, of the patients that you observe after puberty, where you do a scalp analysis, what percent of them show signs of hair diameter diversity, which is just a fancy term to describe hair follicle miniaturization. And again, hair follicle miniaturization means pattern hair loss is present. Well, every single dermatologist responded 100%. 100% of patients that they have observed at a close-up level in their scalps after 13 years old demonstrate signs of hair follicle miniaturization. That means that the genetic predispositions are so ubiquitous. The androgen predisposition is so ubiquitous amongst the general population and westernized populations for the onset of pattern hair loss. But again, that doesn't become cosmetically presentable and cosmetically noticeable until you've lost 30, 40, 50% of that hair density, at which point all of a sudden it feels a little bit different, and that's when people start worrying. So what takes people from 1% diversity to 50%? Hair shedding. And what drives hair shedding? Really dumb decisions dietarily, environmentally, lifestyle-wise, the absence of treatment for chronic conditions, all of the things that we've discussed. So everybody's got the ingredients for pattern hair loss, more or less, but not everybody lives in such a way that's going to accelerate its onset. And that's why a lot of people can make it to 60, 70, 80 years old without any signs of pattern hair loss at all. I mean, look at David Mamet or Willem Dafoe. These guys have incredible hairlines, and they're old, and doesn't seem like they're really losing a lot of hair. So there's a way to do it, and genetics do play a role in the rate of miniaturization per cycle, but it's all dependent on hair shedding.
Yeah, I really appreciate these comments about diet. It's interesting that you've tried so many of them. I certainly have my bias. Anyone listening to this podcast will know that I think a really great way for humans to get lots of nutrients is to eat organs, which is why we do what we do at Heart and Soil. I've certainly heard many anecdotes, and we'll get into this. I know you've got a bunch of slides from people who have done a carnivore diet or an animal-based diet, that their hair seems to get a little bit better. I don't want to overstate these claims or make it sound like it's going to regrow all your hair or you're going to be, like you're going to have amazing afro after this. But there is something here, and diet certainly makes a difference, as we're talking about with this telogen effluvium and this nutrient deficiency. And I think a great way to get nutrient deficiency, as you suggest, is to not include many animal foods in your diet, and that could accelerate the process. And I think, as we've talked about, and I've talked about multiple times on this podcast, anytime we're doing a, quote, restricted diet, we need to be aware of the fact that this could lead to nutrient deficiencies, which is what's so interesting to me about eating animal-based, because though the mainstream might consider it restrictive because there are no vegetables, I'm not convinced there are any nutrient deficiencies here. And from my perspective, it's even a net positive, because you're eliminating so many of the anti-nutrients that are going to interfere with overall nutrient absorption. But why don't we transition? I mean, you have an amazing head of hair, man, and I'm sure you could grow a good beard, even though you don't think so. Like, tell us what you did. Talk to us about these natural therapies for men and for women. We've kind of touched on this a little bit so far. Obviously, eat a nutrient-rich diet. Where do we go from there? Like, what did you do? How did you improve your hair for men and for women? Let's lay it out for them in terms of these natural options beyond the drugs, like what they can do.
Sure. So the first thing is that we go back to that two-step equation. How do you improve hair loss? Well, we know that almost everybody has pattern hair loss, so we have to figure out how to target DHT. That's the first step of the equation for the overwhelming majority of people. And then the second part of that equation is you have to identify your causes of hair shedding, and you have to course correct so that you can normalize that hair cycle and stop the acceleration of this process. But let's go back to that DHT equation first, because we've talked about the evidence supporting the claims that DHT is this causative agent in pattern hair loss. We know that mechanistically it induces that signaling protein transforming growth factor beta 1. It leads to apoptosis in epithelial cells of the dermal papillae cell network. We also know at a bird's eye view that men who lack the ability to produce DHT don't go bald, that men who were castrated before puberty don't go bald, and then if you give men DHT injections, they'll go bald even if they've been castrated. So there's a lot of causative action there, but the questions remain around several facets of hair loss pathology and specifically DHT itself. So for example, why does DHT increase in a balding scalp? A lot of people argue that there's this genetic sensitivity to pattern hair loss, and that the reason why we develop DHT in balding scalps is because of our androgen content in our blood and because of our ability to convert 5-alpha reductase into DHT at the cell sites, and also just because we've got the genes for it. And that might be true, but the irony behind that is that DHT is also what causes or associates strongly with better facial hair regrowth, with better chest growth. So it's this hormone that's paradoxical. It causes hair loss in the scalp, but then it grows hair in the beard, it grows hair in the chest and in other parts of the body. So when I saw this anecdote when I was in college, it's not even an anecdote, it's been well demonstrated in the literature. When I saw this relationship, I thought that's really puzzling. How does the genetic sensitivity argument address something this paradoxical? And there have been a lot of attempts to say that there are certain androgen receptor co-activators, things like HIC5, ARA55, that for whatever reason, when DHT attaches to a cell site in the scalp, these androgen receptor co-activators activate, make the effects of that androgen way more intense, and then cause miniaturization. And for whatever reason, they're absent in beard and chest hairs. So you hear these things and you think, well, great, okay, is it genetic predisposition that causes this co-activation of these androgen receptor cofactors? And then there's no information about that. And you get this default answer back to genetic sensitivity, genetic sensitivity, genetic sensitivity. And the reality is that the DHT pattern hair loss argument is absolutely true. It's causative, but it's just one facet of why we go bald, and it's not complete. There's still a lot that we don't know about this argument. And when you zoom out and you look at the histological features of a balding scalp, when you look at the morphological features of the skull itself for people who end up going bald, there are some things worth noting, and there are inferences that you can make to begin to connect HIC5, ARA55 co-activation, DHT's arrival, the induction of transforming growth factor beta 1, against all of the other things that we see in the scalp environment that precipitates pattern baldness. So that was the basis of the first paper that I published. It was the fact that there is a lot of evidence that there are other factors at play here, and that while finasteride is sort of like this awesome nuclear option for people who want to reduce DHT everywhere, there might be other reasons outside of genetics as to why we end up increasing hair loss or seeing increased hair loss at the top of the scalp, but not elsewhere in our body, and that there's this dependency on DHT. So interestingly enough, when you talk to dermatologists about pattern hair loss, if they're very familiar with examining people's scalps, almost all of them will say that 80% of the individuals who they examine, those individuals with AGA will have really, really tight scalps. And this is important because it suggests that these muscles that surround the scalp perimeter are chronically contracted. Now, the muscles that surround the scalp perimeter that are chronically contracted, they're all anchored to this dense, fibrous, fascia-like membrane that stretches across the top of our scalp like a drum, called the Galea aponeurotica. And this tissue resides directly below the hair follicles. And what's interesting is that when you look at the muscle contractions of these things around the scalp perimeter, it pulls the Galea taut like a drum, and that creates tension. And if that tension is chronic and persistent, a lot of interesting things start to happen in the body. For example, let's look at what happens with tension-mediated environments or pressure-mediated environments or inflammation-mediated environments in other tissues of the body. Well, in the prostate, pressure induces DHT, transforming growth factor beta 1, and scarring or fibrosis. It's the same things that you see in a balding scalp. You see fibrosis at each stage of hair follicle miniaturization alongside those other mediators. In Dupuytren's contracture, when people have a tendon that contracts like this and it gets stuck, you see increased androgen activity, increased transforming growth factor beta 1, increased fibrosis. Same in the balding scalp. Well, if you look at the eyelids of patients with Graves' disease, where they retract, you look at that chronic contracted eyelid, it's the same exact signaling proteins. So who is to say that this relationship between a chronically contracted scalp getting pulled down tightly, creating tension across the top of the scalp, might not be doing the same thing in pattern baldness? Well, interestingly enough, researchers have modeled two-dimensional von Mises models where the frontalis muscles of the scalp and the occipital muscles of the scalp are contracted. And the tensile pattern that is created perfectly aligns with the progression and patterning of male pattern hair loss. And what's more interesting about that is that we know that tension in any tissue induces those same androgen cofactors for the androgen receptor and induces transforming growth factor beta 1. If that tension is persistent and high enough, it translocates out of those cell sites and presumably can enter and begin to influence cells above them, like the dermal papillae cell network. So there's really strong mechanistic evidence that these scalp perimeter muscles might have something to do with pattern hair loss. And then the question is, what about treating them? Well, we have another manuscript in peer review right now that demonstrated that injecting Botox across the scalp perimeter led to injecting Botox across the scalp perimeter over a 10-month period, 2 rounds of injections for patients with androgenic alopecia, led to a 75% response rate, meaning that 75% of individuals saw some degree of hair regrowth. And the average amount of hair regrowth seen across responders and non-responders combined, 18%. Now, the reason why this is significant was because the pilot study that conducted this research by Dr. Frund, it used the same exact hair counting methodologies that Kaufman used to get finasteride FDA approved. And so you actually can make a somewhat scientific, crude comparison between the 2-year outcomes of finasteride, which get a 10% increase in hair counts, versus the 10-month outcomes with Botox, which led to an 18% increase in hair count with roughly the same response rate. So are we nuking our levels of DHT to lower that hormone with a drug? And are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Now, since Dr. Frund's study has come out, there have been several investigations in Chinese populations, in Indian populations, in Caucasian populations, replicating Dr. Frund's results. A 75 to 79% response rate and regrowth metrics that range from 18 to 21%. In fact, when you combine Botox with finasteride, you can see hair count increases of 35% over a year period. And that is significantly cosmetic. And now we're talking about combination therapies that really move the needle. So when I was frustrated with my treatment options, I looked at a lot of this research and I thought to myself, well, you can probably elicit the same exact mechanisms by massaging the scalp perimeter to take these muscles out of chronic contraction. And I noticed myself that I kind of fit the candidate for who would be a good responder to these botulinum toxin therapies. I had a super tight scalp. I'd had a tight scalp since I entered puberty. I am super susceptible to stress, and it's no wonder why I started balding earlier, given a reflection of my diet, my environment, my lifestyle, how I was living during puberty and through high school, and then also, the fact that I had this really tight scalp, and I also had DHT levels that were at the level required to cause hair follicle miniaturization with my genetic predisposition. So I started to massage the scalp perimeter of my scalp to just see how outcomes would grow. Now, simultaneously, there was evidence that you also could target other facets of hair loss pathology, like the fibrosis that accumulates around hair follicles and prevents the regrowth of hair follicles when they're entering into a new anagen stage. This parafollicular fibrosis seems to get progressive as hair loss advances. And it's one thing that finasteride use doesn't really target very effectively. Finasteride targets the hormone DHT. But once that fibrosis sets in, you take away that DHT, you want to create an opportunity for that hair follicle to resize, but it's running out of real estate because fibrosis has set in, scar tissue has set in around that miniaturizing hair follicle. And so you need to address that component as well. So I looked into studies related to microneedling, and I saw that you could actually, through microneedling, improve scar tissue outcomes in the scalp and in the skin. The way that microneedling works is, for anybody who doesn't know what these devices are, they basically look like tiny medieval torture devices. They're little rollers with a bunch of spikes on them that are medical grade needles. And you roll them on your skin to elicit an inflammatory response that's acute. But in that elicitation of inflammation, you send signaling proteins that not only help to reduce scar tissue long term, or at least attenuate and partially reverse that scar tissue. But you also initiate antigen signalings that improve hair counts over time. And we've seen this over and over in the research now. Control groups for studies measuring microneedling plus minoxidil, whereby they just have a microneedling group, they also see increases to hair counts. And so you look at this research, you look at the pathologies of pattern hair loss, you look at all these opportunities to address these things a little bit more cleverly than a single drug, and you develop modalities around them. And for what worked for me, it sounds really stupid, sounds really simple, but it was scalp massages. It was massaging the perimeter of my scalp with my fingertips to really learn at an intimate level how these muscles were contracting and where to press, and then how to relax them. And then on top of that, pinching, pressing, and stretching exercises atop the scalp where I was thinning. And that helped to elicit new antigen signaling proteins. It helped to elicit the same inflammatory mechanisms that microneedling likely does. And in doing so, promote the growth of a new stage of the hair follicle, reduce the levels of, reduce the degree of fibrosis, presumably, and then lead to better hair increasing counts. So the crazy thing about this is that I'm explaining all of this, and you actually might be able to reduce DHT through these mechanisms. So this is totally hypothetical. This is totally, mechanistic, and there's no studies to support this. But technically speaking, DHT is a conversion from testosterone that does not require oxygen whatsoever. And when free testosterone has an opportunity to do something, it can either convert into estradiol, an estrogen, and that conversion is oxygen dependent, and estrogen is very pro-hair. Or it can convert to DHT through the 5-alpha reductase enzyme. Well, when these scalp muscles contract, they reduce blood flow to the top of the scalp because they pinch off the carotid arterial, the subarterial artery bands that then indirectly supply the top of the blood to the scalp. There was a study by Goldman in 1996 that demonstrated that transcutaneous oxygen levels to balding regions were 40% lower than non-balding controls. And his presumption is that this effect couldn't be explained by general hair follicle miniaturization itself. It had to be a physiological roadblock. And that the only thing that would explain this is the contraction of these scalp perimeter muscles that pinch off these carotid arterial branches and then lower blood supply to the top of the scalp. Well, you unpinch those carotid arteries, you do two things. First, you reduce scalp tension, so you have less of an inflammation-mediated DHT cascade. Second, you provide better blood flow to the top of the scalp, and in environments of better blood flow, free testosterone is going to start favoring the conversion not into DHT, but into estradiol. And so that's what I use to see improvements. That's what a lot of people who follow the research on our site use. We've published a peer-reviewed study in a dermatology journal about these massage techniques. It was survey-based, so it's not the highest quality, but it is something. And it seemed like people who adhered to these efforts for 8+ months, 75% of them reported either complete stabilization of their pattern hair loss, which again is a huge win, or some regrowth, with a degree of that hair regrowth varying. And so for people who are feeling trapped between these natural or conventional choices, there really are other options for you. And there's a lot of mechanistic data, anecdotal data, and soon to be clinical data to support a lot of these things that we're talking about.
It's really cool. And this is one of the things I love about doing medicine, is that we see patterns like this across so many disparate diseases. And it's so interesting to think like, oh, okay, this makes sense. If we eat a nutrient-rich diet, and if we think about, and I want to ask you this question next, why the scalp muscles might be contracted, where the stress is coming from, but we can just do basic things like either, dry needle with a device that's $20 on Amazon, or do scalp massage, or do things to allow the blood flow to go to the scalp, to even think about things that could improve endothelial function and allow this blood flow to go to the scalp, that we can reverse or improve so many of the chronic diseases. And I don't even know that we would consider androgenic alopecia to be a disease, but it's certainly a condition that affects men and women. We can reverse all these things, and the answer is often the same across multiple different pathologies, right? That's what's so interesting to me, and it kind of gets back to just the way that we live as humans, and it can be so simple. So this work is so valuable that you're doing, and as you're saying that, I had to use like all of my powers of control not to massage my own scalp, because you're talking about scalp massage, and I'm thinking, number one, I'm here in Costa Rica, and I don't have anybody to massage my scalp. I'm going to have to like convince some friends, bribe some friends with something to get we can trade scalp massages. But I mean, who doesn't like a scalp massage? And if there are techniques that we can use to actually, relax these frontalis muscles and relax these scalp muscles that could also help with hair, I think everybody's going to be on board with that. I can see plenty of husbands and wives trading scalp massages from now on. And these dry needling devices, we can put a link in the show notes or something. They're very cheap on Amazon, and you can run them over your head and perhaps create some inflammation that will result in positive changes at the level of the dermal papillae. And then as you're saying these things, it reminded me of our discussion in the beginning of minoxidil, for which the mechanism wasn't known, but minoxidil is clearly a vasodilator. It's used for people with blood pressure problems as well. When I worked in cardiology as a physician assistant, minoxidil was a fourth-line treatment for resistant secondary hypertension, and minoxidil is a very potent vasodilator. So wouldn't it make sense, with all of these other mechanisms, that something that vasodilates the blood supply of the scalp could improve hair regrowth? And maybe there are other ways to do it by actually improving the blood flow to the scalp by relaxing the muscles that are causing contraction of these blood vessels. So that's a very interesting, I think, congruence there that I was thinking about as you were mentioning all these ideas.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And there's actually a lot of debate between doctors and dermatologists as to whether or not blood flow is a cause or consequence. Reduced blood flow is a cause or a consequence of pattern hair loss. So this is a very polarizing topic, but the argument on both sides is super fascinating. So there's evidence that you have this normal hair cycle of growth, of rest, and then of shedding. And at any point in time, 85% of our hairs are growing, a few percentage of them are in resting, and then there's 10 to 15% that are shedding. And so in the 1960s, there was a lot of histological research done, scalp biopsies, trying to track what hair follicles were doing during each stage of the hair cycle. And they showed that there was a really strong connection between the dermal papillae, the hair follicle, and then the microcapillary networks that support that dermal papillae in the anagen stage or the growth stage of the hair follicle. But then in the catagen stage, where that hair rests, what they showed in late catagen is that what ends up happening is that the hair strand itself disconnects from its hair follicle base and the dermal papillae first. And then that dermal papillae and its subsequent capillary networks degenerate. So because of this ordered process, people presumed that, okay, if the hair sheds first, if male pattern hair loss is related to hair shedding, then technically speaking, that's why hair loss or low blood flow is a consequence of hair loss, because it's a consequence of hair shedding. The hair disconnects first, and then the blood capillary networks dissolve second or degenerate second. And so that's been the argument that a group of dermatological researchers have held onto for a super long time. Now, in my opinion, that's a really myopic view, because when you zoom out and you look at the roadblocks around the top of the scalp and the evidence that this hair cycling mechanism cannot explain what we presume to be significant decreases to transcutaneous oxygen, subcutaneous blood flow to the top of the scalp, and then the evidence linking hypoxic environments to increased DHT, these muscles that are contracting, you zoom out and you realize, okay, yeah, when we look at a 1 millimeter viewpoint, it looks like blood flow or reduced blood flow is a consequence to pattern hair loss. You zoom out, the equation gets a lot more complicated. Reduced blood flow is a driver of pattern hair loss, most likely, and a consequence of hair shedding. So the argument is super nuanced, and the fact that this is still debated as absolutist opinion by people on YouTube and online, it's really annoying because it just kind of spreads misinformation. There is no consensus on this yet.
I'm very familiar with that. There are many parts of nutritional science and medical science that are, promulgated as fact. LDL causes heart disease, fiber is necessary to poop, and, the best thing since unicorn farts, that are not, in my opinion, clear, and that should be continued to be examined carefully, because if these concepts are not as really fleshed out as we believe them to be, they're paradigm shifting for the way that we look at human health. And this idea of the blood flow and the hair follicle is no different. And it's interesting. And I cannot help but think that we have this tendency within medicine, and then that's translated to the mainstream communication to the public, to over rely on medications and to say, hey, we have a medication, it works reasonably well. We don't need to worry about the mechanism or what's actually going on. We don't actually understand the root cause. And that's something that's always bothered me. So I so appreciate this line of thinking with regard to hair. You want to talk a little bit about gray hair, and then I know you have a bunch of slides with maybe some case studies that we should go through.
Yeah, sure. So gray hair is this mostly presumed to be natural phenomenon of aging. And there's basically two different types of graying. There's age-associated genetic graying, and then there's younger graying or accelerated graying. And when we look at the way that our hairs produce pigment, melanin is the pigment-producing cell type at the base of the hair follicle that coats the hair strand. And melanin is produced by melanocyte stem cells in the melanocyte stem cell bulge, right behind those melanin cells. So with gray hair, what we end up seeing is that you might have genetic aging and age-associated graying when you see a depletion of the melanocyte stem cells themselves, which lead to less production of melanin and thereby less coating of the hairs themselves of pigment. Or you can have inflammatory premature graying as a consequence to the destruction of the melanin cells, but not the melanocyte stem cells. Now, the hair cycle is an innately inflammatory process. It's regulated in part by certain signaling proteins associated with inflammation. And inflammation as a byproduct, producing reactive oxygen species, is completely capable of damaging both melanin and melanocyte stem cells. So people who have really aggressive hair cycles because of a hair loss disorder, they might notice that they go graying faster because they lead to stem cell depletion faster. At the same time, it's a really complicated equation. There's some evidence that copper is required for the creation of melanin, so people who have copper deficiencies will prematurely gray. There's some evidence that UV radiation is supposed to accelerate skin-related aging and accelerate the damage of melanin and melanocyte depletions for stem cells. And then at the same time, there have been studies on farmers that have demonstrated that farmers who are out in the sun with no hats have no difference in graying rates than their office counterparts. So the idea that we know anything about graying, that is a whole other topic, and we could probably spend 2 hours on that alone. But I will say that presumably, once those stem cells for the melanocytes become depleted, graying is technically considered irreversible. And that is completely and utterly false. And we know this because there have been really old people who have taken drugs for rheumatoid arthritis, and they've been gray for decades, and they accidentally reversed their graying hair after having complete melanocyte stem cell depletion. So not damage to the melanin or the melanocytes, but the actual melanocyte stem cells themselves. So this is a really complicated equation. And what's interesting is that people on the carnivore diet tend to report significant improvements to their graying, and also, like you mentioned, significant improvements to their hair loss overall. I've got a ton of slides on that because I find this area of research absolutely fascinating, and it's one of the topics for our latest manuscripts.
Yeah, let's dig into it. Let's go into some of the case studies or some of these slides that you're thinking of, but I love that. And hopefully everybody listening to this will know that a great source of copper is liver. And yet another reason that I'm a huge fan of organs and organ meats. I don't really have any concerns about copper. I'll just make a little aside here and then I'll let you take it away. I don't have concerns about copper toxicity with liver consumption of a few ounces a day. There's zinc in muscle meat and zinc in liver. They will balance each other. I just had a friend yesterday say to me, oh, my doctor is concerned about my copper levels in my hair. Maybe this would be an interesting question for you to answer at the end of the podcast. And I said, you can't look at hair mineral analysis. It doesn't reflect total body levels of minerals. And it's something that your body's excreting. It's putting it in the hair. So don't be misled by hair or stool levels of minerals. These are excretion. They're coming out of your body. If you're concerned about copper levels or levels of anything else, check your blood, etc. But I'm not concerned about copper in liver. And I think liver is a great source of copper, which is necessary for so many things, whether it's diamine oxidase, which is involved in histamine, or the production of melanin in these hair cells. So with that said, let's check out your slides and some of these anecdotes you've got or some of these case studies.
Yeah, sure. And I totally agree with you. I think that people doing the carnivore diet have clearly demonstrated that our understanding of nutrition and nutritional research and recommended daily allowances and intake, it's either wrong or we don't even come close to scratching the surface for understanding what we should be eating and how nutrient depletion and repletion is all context specific, dependent on carbohydrate intake and all of these other factors like activity levels, sunlight exposure, vitamin cofactors. It is really, really fascinating. And it's amazing to see how many people improve not only autoimmune disorders, but also their skin health, their digestion. They lose weight without that same sagging that people often experience with rapid weight loss on other diets, all through the carnivore diet. So I look at these anecdotes and I am just as fascinated. In fact, I will disclaim that I have been doing carnivore for about a month and a half right now.
How are you feeling?
The first 7 days were brutal, but I feel really good right now. I honestly don't know if I'm in ketosis. So I've just been eating ribeye steaks for every single meal and drinking water with electrolytes in them. So again, this is just an N=1 experiment. My whole basis is I'm never going to knock something until I actually try it. So this has been my attempt at the carnivore diet. I'm surprised at how good I feel. I've actually been really loving it, and the food cravings have completely gone away. I don't crave alcohol. I don't crave sugar. I have really even energy levels. I feel more clear-headed. It's been a lot of fun in some respects. I'm still waiting for my athletic abilities and my endurance to come back. That's the one thing that's lagging right now. But skin quality, cognitive function, memory, sleep quality, I'm a huge fan so far.
Got to get you some organs, my man. How come you're not eating organs?
You know, I tried that at the very beginning, the first week of the experiment, and I think getting used to just eating meat at first was so gag-inducing that when I got to the organs, I couldn't do it. And so I'm not unfamiliar with eating liver. I'm a huge fan of liver, but I never just ate liver and then other meat products and nothing else. And so it became a hurdle for me. Since then, I've adjusted, and I probably could start to introduce those foods without issue.
What about desiccated organs like we make it hard in soil? That would have been easy for you.
That would have been great. I'm glad we're having this conversation.
We'll get you some. I'm gonna send you some desiccated organs, man. I'm gonna send you some desiccated organs.
Cool.
And I will just say this. You didn't ask for my opinion, but I'll just say this. Don't be dogmatic about keto, in my opinion. You can take it or leave it. Like, carbohydrates, in my opinion, are not the enemy. And I think that your athletic stuff will come back immediately if you add in a moderate amount of carbohydrates that are low toxicity. This is sort of the beauty of an animal-based diet, in my opinion, a diet that's mostly animal meat and organs with some of the least toxic carbohydrates from fruit and honey. But we can talk about that offline. That's a great sort of segue to sort of like the reasons that I'm interested in an animal-based diet, and you'll have to keep us posted. But I'll let you, if you have any thoughts about that, or we can just jump into your slides. I didn't mean to.
It's my fault. I teed it up, so I apologize. But okay, let's talk about the carnivore diet. So for background, part of the community of our site, we run this membership community whereby we offer support for people trying to find a path toward hair regrowth with or without the drug model. And it's designed to maximize people's chances and degree of success with hair regrowth. And so we're really open to any type of intervention that's built around somebody's needs and preferences, but then more importantly, actually gets results and has clinical data supporting the usage and the efforts that people want to employ. And so within our community, we have this forum, and a few people started to talk about the carnivore diet last year. And this was before I had a high familiarity with the research in this area, and before I had ever really considered trying this diet myself. We had one individual who said that she had tried a variety of different diets, but that she began to see significant improvements on the carnivore diet alongside scalp massaging in terms of her hair quality, her hair density, her hair thickness. I can show you this slide right now. Hold on. Okay, can you see that?
Not yet. There it goes.
Okay. So again, when I'm sharing these slides, you have to keep in mind that photo quality varies. People do their best to track progress in our membership with the tools that they have available to them. But there's going to be slight lighting differences and slight angle differences that can accentuate somebody's degree of hair regrowth and the improvements that they're seeing. So with that prefaced, this is the woman who claimed that she had tried a lot of different interventions, both natural and conventional, had no ability to see a stop in her pattern hair loss, but that all of a sudden, after about 6 months on the carnivore diet alongside these scalp massages, she's seeing significant hair improvements and a sharpening of the hairline. And on the left-hand side column, you can see her before photos, and then on the right-hand side, you can start to see some density improvements here. And so she shared this in our community, and I thought to myself, wow, this is really interesting. But you know what? I guess that she probably has female pattern hair loss, like most females who are adults do, but that because she had had some digestive related distress, because she had had some skin problems, I hypothesized that she probably also was dealing with some sort of underlying bout of telogen effluvium, and that was unresolved until she went on a carnivore diet. And when you think about carnivore diets, you think that red meat is basically one of the least allergenic foods for people, and it seems like people adhering to these diets despite experiencing some what you would consider serum nutrient deficiencies, don't express any of the clinical manifestations of that deficiency. So I looked at this case and I thought, okay, well, she probably has female pattern hair loss. She's seeing hair density improvements, but I don't believe this is from the carnivore diet. My guess is that she's lowering background inflammation, normalizing her hair cycle, and probably seeing improvements to telogen effluvium, and she thinks it's the result of female pattern hair loss. So that was my first anecdote, looking into this and seeing the improvements that people were sharing. But then I went online and I saw that Sean Baker had shared this photo of somebody with very, very clear male pattern hair loss at the crown. You can see in that first photo from January, he's got significant thinning. And I reached out to this person, and he told me that he had tried finasteride in the past, but experienced really bad side effects. And so he couldn't take the drug. And he was also a bodybuilder. And he started the carnivore diet. And over a series of months from January to April, he began to see significant hair density improvements to what is most likely exclusively pattern hair loss. And so this really piqued my curiosity, because you have this poor responder to finasteride due to side effects. But now you see that this diet might actually be having an influence, not on that hair shedding side of things, but rather on the DHT side of things. So this really piqued my curiosity. I thought to myself, okay, well, this is interesting, but again, this is just another anecdote, and I'm going to reserve judgment until I have more information. And then I had somebody reach out to me named Brian. These are his photos. And Brian is a member of our site, and Brian took finasteride for 2 years and saw zero improvement. He only saw a continuation of his pattern hair loss. He didn't see any side effects, but he saw significant hair thinning the entire time that he was on the drug, to the point where it was just not worth it for him to take it, so he cycled off of it. Well, around that time, he and his wife got really interested in health, and they had read about the carnivore diet, and they decided to employ that alongside these scalp massages that are recommended in our membership for people who want to try them. And over the course of a year, he saw significant hairline improvements. So you can see in that first photo, he basically doesn't have a hairline, and then a year later, he's restored a significant portion of that hairline and seen an appreciable degree of hair thickening. And according to him, this is just on a carnivore diet and just doing the scalp massages. And within a week of starting the carnivore diet, he began to see really cosmetic decreases to hair shedding and knew that something was going on that he couldn't fully explain. And this is what really got me very, very interested in this subject. Now, you might look at this photo and say, okay, well, this person is they still have a significant amount of hair loss. They still have a significant room to go. Like, is this that impressive? Well, to contextualize this, finasteride is generally relegated to stopping hair loss and leading to a 10% increase in hair count over a series of 2 years, at which point its efficacy plateaus. So any cosmetic degree of hair regrowth outside of the drug model is absolutely worth noting. And in fact, when you go into the clinical studies on finasteride, you're going to see photos like this one right here, where over a 2-year period, you see somebody with significant hair loss at the crown, but then 2 years later, they've got great hair density. Well, guess what? This was one patient selected to represent results of the best responders out of 1,000 people. So there's only a small percentage of people who see a change like this while taking finasteride. This is the best of the best results. And the reason why we know this is because there was a news channel that did an investigation and special into certain hair loss drugs. And they gave 5 different guys finasteride for the course of the year. And here are the results that they highlighted for their best of the best responder. Now, at first glance, you might look at this photo and think, oh, wow, things look improved. Well, look more closely. Look at the background color on the far right photo. This is shot in a completely darker room with darker lighting to obfuscate the fact that this person has not had much change at all. I mean, imagine taking a hair loss drug that reduces DHT for an entire year and going from the left-hand side of this photo to basically the exact same, the right-hand side of this photo. This is the power of finasteride. It stops the progression of pattern hair loss. So when you see results like this, or like this, or like this, you start to pay attention and you start to ask questions, because these are clear cases of pattern hair loss. And we know that pattern hair loss is mediated by DHT and genetics. And yet here's somebody doing a diet, greatly improving pattern hair loss. And why is that? Why is that happening? I'm going to stop sharing because I don't have too much to talk about in terms of what's on screen for like the next 5 minutes. But do you have any questions so far about what I'm talking about?
No, it's just great to see those pictures. And if people want to go to the YouTube video, that'll be on my channel. They can see the regrowth of those hairs, the hair. And I'll just say that one guy has some amazing, like, mad scientist hair. So Brian, I think it was, like, that's just, I couldn't help but think of that. Like, he has this like wild hair, but I love it. He's a kindred spirit there for us. So that's amazing. It's just, I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah, it's really cool to see what he does with his hair now that he has more of it. You know, he can grow it longer. It looks a little bit more stylish. It definitely borderlines on the mad scientist side of things, and I'm into
Perfect. If only Doc Brown from Back to the Future could hear this conversation, then we'd have even more amazing Doc Brown, hairstyles going.
So, yeah. So the reason why people need to pay attention to results like this are because the general consensus amongst dermatologists, amongst hair loss investigators, is that diet is only supposed to be a negative regulator for hair loss outcomes, which means that a really bad diet is going to exacerbate inflammation. It's going to lead to nutrient deficiencies. It's going to attack that right side of the equation, the hair shedding, that's going to feed into and accelerate pattern hair loss. But there's no evidence in the clinical literature that a great diet that is nutrient replete, calorie replete, and meets all of your demands for reducing allergens and inflammation, there's no evidence thus far that will stop or reverse pattern hair loss. At best, it will only slow its progression. And this is really important to think about, because here are these cases of people who are, yes, also employing other modalities like massaging, but who also were non-responders to finasteride, and now all of a sudden are seeing significant improvements from employing this carnivore diet. And so the question then becomes, well, what's going on here, and what hypothetical and mechanistic data can we bring to the table that might begin to build a hypothesis? So that kind of brings us into this second component of the discussion, which is this research into how our gut bacteria changes on carnivorism, and how our gut bacteria actually has an influence over DHT, more so than we ever thought imaginable. And this is new research that came out just 2 years ago. So in 2019, this investigation group sought to determine what the influence of gut bacteria was on the excretion of hormones, specifically testosterone and DHT. Now, what's interesting is that we know that there's a bidirectional relationship between our hormonal profile and our gut bacteria. The reason why we know this is that if we look at a mouse that's a male and we take their microbiome and all of the gut bacteria inside of it, and we inject that into a female mouse, we'll see that female mouse's testosterone in the blood increase. So we know that bacteria have this influence over raising serum testosterone and serum androgen activity. And then the opposite is also true. Serum testosterone, when you inject that, it changes the microbiome composition of a gut. So the onset of androgens can change the way that somebody's gut bacteria looks and behaves, and the biodiversity and the species count and all of these other things. And so these researchers sought to determine, well, how does gut bacteria influence our ability to get rid of DHT that's no longer needed in our body? And this is a super simplistic explanation to something that's rather complicated, but after our body is done with a hormone and it wants to get rid of it, that hormone, specifically DHT, binds with an enzyme called glucuronylyl transferase. and it becomes bound to glucuronic acid, and it changes that hormonal structure from a lipid-loving or a fat-loving molecule that wants to attach to cell sites into a water-loving molecule, which increases its probability of entering into the small intestine so that our systems can flush it out. Now, when DHT binds to glucuronyl transferase, it becomes what's known as glucuronidated DHT. It's inactive, it's water soluble, it's not going to have a huge effect on hormonal activity, and we end up excreting these things out in our stools as a means to get rid of the hormones that we're done using so that our testes and our brain, or our ovaries in our brain, can begin to produce more, and the cycle continues. So what these researchers did is they took a group of mice that had no microbiome. They were germ-free mice bred without a microbiome, no germs around. And they took a group of mice with a conventionally raised environment so that they had this microbiome. And they measured the rate of DHT excretion and the activity of DHT levels in these mice as they excreted things. And what they found was that gut bacteria in the group of mice that had a microbiome were producing this enzyme called beta-glucuronidase as a byproduct of eating carbohydrates, as a byproduct of, living off of fiber and all of the other particles that these things feed off of. They would produce this enzyme that would attach to glucuronidated DHT, dissociate the glucuronic acid from DHT, and then turn it back into its active form, so that now there's a potential for that DHT hormone to get sucked up by the enterocyte cells and then through the enterohepatic system get kicked back into the circulation system. And what they showed is that with the germ-free mice, they excreted essentially all of the DHT that was entered into the small intestine. So there was no reverse process on this. So they were excreting all of the DHT, whereas these mice with a microbiome, their gut bacteria essentially acted as a gatekeeper to which DHT decided to get reactivated and potentially recirculate into the body, and which DHT actually left the body. And this is a pretty revolutionary study because there were also other things that implicated gut bacteria and hormonal relationships extra-intestinally that these researchers investigated. So the first thing is that they found that these mice that had the ability to have a microbiome and thereby deglucuronidate DHT, turn it back into its active form, those mice, when you measured their stool samples, they had 20x the amount of activated DHT in their stools as were circulating in their blood. So they went and they did the same test on human subjects, healthy men, and they found that healthy men had 70-fold more activated DHT levels in their stools than circulating in their blood, which implicates this hormone as a massive reservoir inside of our guts, and DHT as its gatekeepers. So it decides what leaves and what stays and recirculates. That is really, really interesting. And when you looked at the histological features of these germ-free mice that were bred in an environment where there was perfect regulation of hormone production between the testes and the brain, and then in addition to that, excretion, there was no interference whatsoever. You looked at their histological examinations for their testes. They were larger, better developed. Their liver had higher testosterone levels. Extra-intestinally, they were a healthier looking mouse than the conventionally raised mice. And so when I think about these things, and then I think about the carnivore diet, well, the carnivore diet is unique in that, in my opinion, it's the only diet on the planet where you can effectively completely cut out what is considered a macronutrient, carbohydrates, and thereby fiber, and thrive. So what do carbohydrates and fiber do? Well, they help to feed our gut microbiome. We know anecdotally that gut bacteria have to use these things to survive. And when you begin to put a cap on the amount of food that they receive, for example, when you remove carbohydrates entirely, you potentiate a reduction in the total population of bacteria. So you can get some die-off of bacteria. And in addition to that, you create greater gut microbiome diversity. So you have more competition for fewer food sources, which drive down population rates of bacteria, potentially. And then in addition to that, the carnivore diet has anecdotally demonstrated in humans that you get greater gut biodiversity, which means that from a percentage standpoint, that bacteria producing beta-glucuronidase now shrinks in number. So you have an absolute drop and then a relative increase in species diversity, which potentiate in both cases a slight reduction in that beta-glucuronidase activity. Well, finasteride reduces blood levels of DHT by 60 to 70%. That's great. 70-fold more DHT is found in our stool samples. So there's a lot of DHT that probably isn't getting addressed with that drug alone. And the reason that I say that is because if you implement a diet that now drives down and normalizes DHT excretion and the drop-off of these bacteria that can potentiate the recirculation of DHT and the worsening of certain outcomes for certain individuals extraintestinally, well, now you do that by lowering carbohydrates. You lower the number of gut microbiome, the absolute number of gut bacteria in your system. You increase species diversity. You lower beta-glucuronidase activity, and you might have a finasteride-like effect just by going on the carnivore diet to reduce total circulating DHT levels. And to bring this all the way back from about like an hour and a half ago, we were talking about how DHT can increase in environments of inflammation because in inflammation states, testosterone tends to be a little bit lower, DHT is more potent, and there's this yin and yang where now you're raising DHT levels to compensate for the lower testosterone levels. So reflecting this back into the microbiome, are we actually reducing inflammation? Are we actually improving and reducing beta-glucuronidase activation? Are we reducing our recirculation of DHT? We don't know the answers to these questions yet, but it seems like the carnivore diet, for a percentage of individuals trying it, might have a finasteride-like effect on this hormone that we know is intimately tied to pattern hair loss. And we know that a huge percentage of people doing carnivore, not all of them, but a huge percentage report a cessation in pattern hair loss, improvements to hair graying. And these are anecdotes that we should not ignore because this is how science begins. And it's just very fascinating stuff.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So I'll offer a few comments here. I actually will offer a different perspective on a few things that you're hypothesizing. I don't completely agree with the line of thinking. So I will say that beta-glucuronidase, high levels of beta-glucuronidase are correlated with something called dysbiosis in the human gut. But I think we must be very careful to conflate this with carbohydrate consumption. And I haven't read this study with the mice, but I'm almost sure that the carbohydrate they're using in the mice is sucrose. So they're not feeding the mice a species-appropriate carbohydrate and seeing, quote, dysbiosis or include glucuronidase. I think the important point to start with is that, yes, beta-glucuronidase being high in the gut, in the stool, and we can look at this with tests like a GI map or whatever, is a marker of dysbiosis in humans. How they got to the dysbiosis is delicate, and I am not convinced that carbohydrates per se do this in humans at all, because there are plenty of carbohydrate-consuming cultures, whether it's Hadza, the Yukon, who don't have dysbiosis, who don't have high levels of beta-glucuronidase on their stool samples. So there's something else going on here. And broadly speaking, I think you could be pretty safe in saying that it's a Western diet that leads to high levels of beta-glucuronidase. But I think we have to be really careful, again, not to conflate this with carbohydrates in general or all carbohydrates. I'm not a fan of all carbohydrates, but I just don't think, or I really don't believe, that an otherwise healthy human, ancestrally species-appropriate carbohydrates are going to feed the bacteria that are going to make beta-glucuronidase, that are going to increase the levels of this enzyme in the gut. I think that's taking it a step too far, in my opinion. And I've observed multiple times that long-term carbohydrate restrictions has all sorts of problems for humans in terms of electrolyte abnormalities, palpitations, and I just fear the dogmatism in the carnivore community around carbohydrates. So I want to push back on that gently. The other thing I want to mention is that UDP glucuronidyltransferase, is one of these enzymatic systems in the space to detoxification in the liver that adds a glucuronide moiety to all sorts of things. And that enzyme is an enzyme I've talked about a lot as inhibited by piperine, which is found in pepper. So that's kind of a corollary thing that I think is interesting, that you can inhibit this glucuronidating enzyme in your liver, which is going to further cause problems with detoxification by plant compounds like pepper, which have piperine in them. And it's just another idea that I have advanced in my book and otherwise, that we probably should not be eating a ton of plant seeds or compounds that have inhibitors of UDP glucuronyl transferase. Now, when we're coming back to this dysbiosis piece, I do think there's something here. And what's interesting for me is that I would love to take a look at that paper with the mice, because like I said, I'm almost positive they're feeding them sucrose. These mouse diets are garbage, and we have to be careful when we translate them to human diets, because they're feeding them like seed oils and sucrose. And if seed oils and sucrose lead to increases in beta-glucuronidase from dysbiosis, then we have to say, oh, okay, so they fed mice what my friend Peter from Hyperlipid would call crap in a bag, and they got dysbiosis. Now, what irks me is when people in the carnivore community take this so far as to say, see, carbohydrates are bad for humans, they're going to cause dysbiosis, they're going to cause increased beta-glucuronidase. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but I don't want people to hear this and get worried about carbohydrates in the right context. And this is actually an interesting time to consider something. So hopefully I'm going to get Tommy Wood back on the podcast, or one of the other authors of this paper, which is Lucy Mailing and someone else. There is a lot of flexibility in the human gut. And this is something that is quite fascinating, that my friend Tommy Wood just published this paper, and he's proud of it, and I'm super proud of him, Reframing Nutritional Microbiota Studies to Reflect an Inherent Metabolic Flexibility of the Human Gut, a narrative review focusing on high-fat diets. So interestingly, this paper is about how ketogenic high-fat diets that are fiber poor might not lead to problems with the human gut in general, like many would say that we need fiber, et cetera, and the human gut can shift and do all these things. But I think it's also important to point out that the microbiome can feed on protein. And so it's not just fiber that increases the bacteria in our gut. It can also be protein. It shifts the populations. I like what you said about diversity. When I've checked my alpha diversity on zero fiber diets, it's quite high. Now, at the time I checked it last, I was eating honey and meat and organs and desiccated organ supplements, but my diversity was very high, and I've shared that data in the past. But I think there's something here. I just want to be careful that we're not too quickly jumping to the conclusion that it's all carbohydrates that are contributing to the problem here. I think that I'm willing to accept that it's dysbiosis, and we need to understand where that dysbiosis comes from. And in fact, one of the interesting things is that there's actually data that seed oils lead to dysbiosis in animal models. Again, we're back to mouse and rat models, but there's good evidence that seed oils could be contributing just as much as a sucrose-based carbohydrate. But I think it's pretty clear that the combination of a seed oil and processed sugar is not going to cause good changes in the mouse microbiome. But I'm just not sure that I'm ready to accept that the papaya on my counter in Costa Rica is going to do that, as well as the honey that I ate in Tanzania with the Hadza. So there's something there. I don't want to go too far.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you. And I tend to try to reserve judgment and opinion until we have enough data. And this is one of those topics where we just don't know. It's a hypothesis. It could be completely wrong. In terms of what you'd mentioned about gut dysbiosis and beta-glucuronidase activity, the one thing that I would want to look for in terms of hair improvements in the absence of carbohydrates is that it seems like these results amongst the carnivore community are overexpressing, and I haven't come across any on people who are just doing low carb. So that doesn't really mean that carbohydrates are problematic. It's just something that I've noted. I've seen a lot of people who thought that they improved their hair loss on ketogenic or low carb diets, but it really was just that they were dealing with telogen effluvium. But I haven't seen the anecdotes at the same degree or the rate of people demonstrating and being fully convinced and seeing significant Norwood recoveries from pattern hair loss on that same diet. It seems to only be happening on the carnivore diet, and I don't have an answer for that. It could be that the carnivore diet improves, or reduces inflammation and gut dysbiosis to a whole new level. But it's also the reality that the carnivore diet is probably just one way to cross the finish line here, and that the definition of a carnivore diet, it's so dramatically different depending on who you talk to. So I'm trying right now what I would consider the most restrictive version, because some people really believe in this restrictive version. And again, I don't want to knock anything until I try it for an appreciable period. But I have every intention of reintroducing carbohydrates that are safe at some point in the next few months, because I want to see how I feel on that version of the diet as well, that also constitutes more carnivorism. Now, the truth is that there are people who have not changed their diet, but who have changed their microbiome and seen significant improvements to a bunch of hair loss disorders. So some of the anecdotes that we have in our literature base.
Yeah.
Can you see this right now?
There it is.
So this is this is an individual who has what's known as diffuse alopecia areata. It's an autoimmune form of hair loss. They also had been dealing with a variety of issues related to gut dysbiosis. They underwent a fecal microbiota transplant from a healthy individual, and several months later, their graying reversed and their hair thickened. And this was after having dealt with patchy gray hair and diffuse alopecia areata for years and years and years. So that's somebody who changed no dietary interventions at all, just changed their microbiome, still was presumably eating carbohydrate, saw a hair density improvement. This person saw an even more dramatic improvement after undergoing a fecal microbiota transplant because of a C. difficile infection. Again, this is a different type of hair loss disorder. This is alopecia areata, borderlining on alopecia universalis, and it is autoimmune in nature. It's a different pathology from pattern hair loss. But look, change in the microbiome, fecal microbiota transplant, hair regrowth following 18 months after the procedure. But where this gets more interesting is that there have been anecdotes on hair loss forums of people also experiencing hair regrowth from fecal microbiota transplantations from pattern hair loss. And again, this supports your assertion that it might not have anything to do with carbohydrate in the carnivore diet specifically, but in reducing gut dysbiosis to an appreciable degree. Because this individual, a wide range of allergens, a wide range of gut dysbiosis features, loose stools, skin quality problems, and he had also tried finasteride in the past, seen no success whatsoever, cycled off the drug, went and got a fecal microbiota transplant. And this is a very clear-cut case of what looks like pattern hair loss. Within a week of that transplant, no changes to diet, noticed allergies improved, noticed hair shedding reduced. A year later, he says that his hair got significantly thicker, which you can see on the right-hand side of this photo. So you look at these outcomes and you think, that's really interesting. Those are cases that support your hypothesis that it's the biome itself and not necessarily the inclusion or exclusion of carbohydrate that could be driving these changes, but that these changes to the microbiome aren't just limited to improving telogen effluvium, chronic telogen effluvium, scarring alopecias, alopecia areata. They're also potentially implicated in the improvement of male and female pattern hair loss. And that's an area of research that has no studies.
It's very cool. Basically. The other thing to appreciate about a carnivore diet is that it doesn't just exclude carbohydrates, it excludes a lot of lectin-containing foods, which could be triggering dysbiosis as well. I mean, there's some fascinating research that I came across when I was writing my book about lectins affecting the actual mucus-producing cells in the gut. And if the mucus-producing cells are negatively affected by lectins and there are fenestrations in the mucus layer, then certain populations of bacteria can overgrow when they touch the actual GI epithelium, leading to inflammation. So there's a lot of fascinating mechanisms about the exclusion of vegetables, and I will be the first person to tell you that I am fascinated by what happens in human health when we exclude vegetables and plant material in general. But yeah, there's a lot here, and it's totally interesting. Man, we could go on forever. I so appreciate this work. I so appreciate the podcast. The last thing I always ask people is, what is the most radical thing that you have done recently? And I'm curious to hear your answer to this one.
Survive raising a 2-year-old in San Francisco. That's been pretty radical. I mean, my life is researching parenting and partnering. That is everything that I do right now because we have this young daughter and she's amazing and we love her so much. And it's tough to do that in a city that isn't necessarily built for children. So the fact that we've made it for 2 years and are still here, I would say that that's kind of radical. Unfortunately, my answer is not much.
That's pretty radical, man. That's pretty radical. And we are definitely, I'm going to get off this call with you and send you some supplements from Heart and Soil so you can get some organs in your diet. Where can people find more of your work? Where should they go to connect with you?
They can go to perfecthairhealth.com. We publish papers as open access. In fact, we have a demonstration video and PDF instruction on how to do the massages, at least the 2016 version of them, that was a part of that peer-reviewed paper. So you don't have to face a paywall to get this type of information. If you want to work one-on-one with me, or if you want access to my research team and all of our success stories and our members, we do have a membership site for people who want to go that secondary step. But to get started, you can find me at perfecthairhealth.com, and we've got a ton of free information.
Awesome. I'll screen share it here for people so they can see that. And then they can go here to publications, I imagine, and to the 2 links is the massage and this paper.
Yeah, it's in that paper. We have a few more papers that have been published that we haven't put on that page yet. So thank you for reminding me to make a well-needed
Okay, cool.
update.
Yeah, I'm sure people will want to check that out. That's awesome. All right, man. I think there's going to have to be a part 2, but we'll sign off for now. I appreciate you. Thanks for doing this work.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for the opportunity. I mean, we haven't even gotten to the topic of why full hair regrowth is possible and the evidence supporting it. There are some fascinating case reports there. So next time we can talk about
We'll do a part 2. All right, man. Awesome. Love it.